Okay, let's get started. Thank you for being on time. And hopefully people can hear online too. You think we're good, Dave? Okay. What Peter and I are going to do right now is I just want you to write down 4 metrics. You should have a piece of paper, just turn over the agenda and write down 4 metrics. Operating margin, inventory turns, revenue per employee, and return on capital expended, ROCE. So those are the 4 metrics that show up the most in the modeling. Operating margin, revenue per employee, ROCE, and inventory turns. And now what we're going to do is contrast that. So if we are improving those 4 metrics, we are able to improve market cap per employee. And remember what market cap per employee is. It's number of shares by the price of the share divided by the number of employees. So Peter, how long have you worked with the SCOR model? Peter's turning on his volume. And if you can't hear Peter online, then just put it in the chat because we have the chat up. So Peter, how long have you worked with the SCOR model?
I haven't worked with the SCOR model as a 3M'er since 1996.
Okay. And how does the SCOR model improve those 4 metrics? Everybody familiar with the SCOR model? The students in the class? Do you teach that here? And so your supply chain classes, have you had the SCOR model? Okay, no. Okay, I mean, we're amongst friends now. I mean, we've broken bread together. We're friends now. We could say no. So I actually worked at a company called AMR Research, and AMR Research and PRTM got together and said one of the issues is that everybody uses a different definition for supply chain. So if you go to company A versus company B versus company C, the term supply chain means something different, which it does even today. And so the question was there a way to model the supply chain to help people to come to a more common understanding within an organization about what is supply chain? And that was the original intent of the SCOR model.
Well, I figured out how to do the unmute, Laura, so I can go back.
Okay, all right. So AMR Research was an analyst group and PRTM was a consulting group. PRTM got purchased those assets are still out there. ASCM bought the SCOR model when? 2014. Okay, and it's a way to communicate because, believe it or not, transportation people seldom talk to demand planners. I mean, in large organizations, they're working in functions. So Peter, how long have you worked with the SCOR model?
So 1996.
So you're going to come up here and grab a mic.
Grab a mic. But I can just go from here.
Yeah.
So 1996 with the SCOR version, I think at that time was like 6.0. And I think this was the most recent addition. A huge change in terms of how we represented the model. So it used to look linear, plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable. This now is actually 2 infinity loops, again, connected. Big changes. We busted deliver into order and fulfill to accommodate the omni-channel. We converted transform or make into transform to, again, accommodate product as a service. We really focused on putting in a new process called orchestrate. So if you think about taking this model from a visual standpoint and putting it in kind of a hierarchy, which it's not, but if you have to, if your mind thinks that way, it's kind of orchestrate, planning, execution kind of things. And so navigationally, again, score.ascm.org. So all of you folks online, open up a new browser and go there. Those of you that have things here, go there because I think it's great to click around on. Before I answer your question, I'm going to do 30-second navigation thing here for everybody. Again, you can access process, performance, people, practices. Performance is where we're going to spend our time. But I think one of the questions that we're trying to answer is, once I figure out how to measure it and how to correlate what's in SCOR, because it's not a perfect match, and I'll show you where we got it right and where we're not quite there yet. But then how do you start to break that metric down into who's going to contribute to making that happen between plan, orchestrate, and the executional pieces. So again, if you think about navigationally,
So Peter, I just want to clarify, this is the new SCOR model.
Yep.
This is called SCOR DS.
correct.
And it is free and available for anybody, and it's the only model I know of that has metrics associated with the process flows. And many people in industry will refer to SCOR benchmarking, which is a way that companies can compare themselves to others to kind of say, am I doing well or not doing so well? And so it has evolved now for almost 2.5 decades, but it's based upon industry collaboration. So sort of people that are committed and knowledgeable get together, but there is no research rigor that really ties the common understanding of supply chain to kind of the work that we've been doing here at Georgia Tech that says, do we have collinearity? Are we really driving against a clear objective function? And there are a lot of metrics here, right? How many metrics are in this model?
So we're going to look at 20 that are what we would call level 1. Again, we got some of the attributes right. Many of them are too specific. But if you were to look at all of the diagnostic measures, we're talking about 250 plus.
And part of the issue in the industry is people measure too many things. I was working with a high-tech and electronics company for sales and operations planning. Everybody knows what sales and operations planning is. If you don't, there's such thing as a stupid question. It's the tactical process of how do I match supply and demand. Anyway, I was visiting as an industry expert this company, and they had 75 metrics for sales and operations planning. And we spent the whole afternoon. They had a great lunch, and they went through all the metrics. And I was expecting we were going to have an SNOP discussion. And I said to them, how do you do anything with 75 metrics? And they're like, we don't. We just talk about the metrics, right? And so, in a good SNOP process, you would want to have these metrics be your high-level metrics to drive that decision to get balance. And, if you think about SNOP, let's just have a conversation. Dave, how many metrics do you have in SNOP at Dow? Lots. 10, 20, 30, 40, 20 or 30. Mary? Okay. And one of the issues is we've sort of lost our way on forecasting, right? And that we believe that consensus forecasting would give us a better forecast, but, there's an awful lot of politics in organizations. And so, most companies in that move to consensus forecasting actually degrade the forecast when compared to forecast value add, which is looking at the naive forecast. And I would encourage everyone to get familiar with the forecast value add methodology. How about Western Digital? How many metrics do you have in SNOP?
Oh, we have many actually. There are 100 plus actually.
100 plus.
Yeah. The reason is that, every team does their own silos. Right? Everyone has their own areas.
Yeah. Yeah. So how is it possible to move forward with 100 plus metrics so that
That's what they're trying to do.
you have no understanding of cross correlation or, Dave just talked about the rigor that we went through to look at cluster analysis, 110 metrics in SNOP, you just kind of circle the drain. Fred, your experience with companies, how many metrics have you seen that they use in SNOP? And it's a struggle. It's like, you're taking your firstborn out of their arms. How about at Converse?
Oh, 40.
About 40, right? How about our friend from biotech?
There is no.
No SNOP. So, okay, that's a whole different discussion, right? Have a sandwich. So we're measuring a lot of stuff, right? But they're primarily functional metrics and they're closely tied to functional bonus incentives. And they're not really tied to a balanced scorecard that ties to strategy. So you've got to start with, what am I trying to do as a company? Because our friend here from Georgia Tech started this off right of, what am I driving for value for customers? And then we should have a balanced scorecard, which what we're trying to do here is build the financial elements of that balanced scorecard. But we've sort of lost our way here, right? We've got, tens, even hundreds of metrics that aren't really aligned, have collinearity, and aren't rationalized. So in the SCOR model, let's talk about that, Peter.
Yep.
So I think you got to come here now.
I will.
Okay.
So if you look at the chart, and those of you on Zoom, if you look, at the performance section, you'll see along the top, there's three main categories of metrics: resilience, economic, and then sustainability. And so I think where we got it right, because those are three new categories, where we got it right was at the attribute level. So if you think within resilience, there's three main attributes: reliability, responsiveness, how long it takes to get the order done, and then agility. We can have, that's another meeting. Economically, we looked at cost, profit, and assets. So at the attribute level, I think we got the categories correct, the attribute categories correct. And then sustainability, that whole thing is evolving. But we think based on other standards, we got that right. So the question is at the actual metric itself. So we don't have operating margin, so that's a miss. We don't have ROCE, but we have something similar, so that's a miss. We have cost of goods and total supply chain management cost for cost, so again, a miss. And then when you think back to inventory turns, it's buried inside of assets, cash to cash. So it's not called out as a level 1 metric, it's 2 or 3 or something like that. So the good news is we got close. And this research then will allow us to actually refine it, so that people can start with, here's what's going to add value, here's how I can benchmark myself against me and others, and then eventually here's how we can then bring these measures back to the processes and those things that are going there. So good news and bad news, Laura.
So what do you've been at this a long time and you've been following the work with Georgia Tech
Absolutely.
for a long time. So what have you learned? If you were, making corrections here, what have you learned?
I love what you keep telling David is keep it simple and it has to be applicable, between those two things. So let's not overthink this. The very first question everybody asks is, how is my supply chain performing against other folks? And I think what this research is going to show is, what are the most important things that will shape how we want to measure our supply chain? And you've changed that. Operating margin for again, I've been in manufacturing a long time, far different conversation than cost of goods. Because now you're involving the other part of the organization and you're not playing a shell game, on overall operating income. I think, go ahead.
So be more specific there. What's the shell game that's played?
Well, cost of goods, again, do I put transportation costs in cost of goods or do I keep it separate? Do I move distribution costs into a cost of sales or do I keep it within the cost of goods? If I outsource something, do I count it or can I move it in a different place? I think there's different ways. And ultimately, the accountability of who owns those cost centers are different, as you've described. And so you get into this, again, as you've described already, this cross-functional game, that people play. Same thing goes for inventory. If procurement is being judged on how much inventory that they're bringing in, then they're going to want to move it into WIP status as quickly as possible or have the supplier hold it. And again, it's causing negative impact on latency and all those other things that we value as important. So I think elevating the game on these measures to organizational level, I think is going to be great. The other one is getting access to the benchmark. I think the gap And the research challenge for us next then is to say, once we've defined the supply chain fundamental score, as we talked about before lunch, and you know now that, mine looks like this and my industry looks like this, what are the process drivers to move the needle? And I think as you've described, SCOR has been built kind of bottom up. And, and this latest edition, accounts for 80% of all of the things that we needed to change to make it relevant in today's marketplace. I think connecting it from the top down, using research, not using consulting, I think is a cool thing. And I think that, from my point of view, having come up this way into this research, that's how I see the value.
So there are a lot of metrics here, like supply chain agility. How do you measure that, Peter?
So you start with the hard one. I was going to go to reliability first, but so agility, again, is defined by how fast can I respond to unplanned demand? And I'm paraphrasing from the definition here. There's not a mechanical way of calculating this. I think the closest mathematical way of doing that is to getting your stack lead time from your master data, adding that all up for each SKU and doing a weighted average. That gets you the closest to here's how agile, and that's based on where am I sourcing this from, how long does it take me to order it, blah, 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 blah. I think that's the closest people have gotten. But when you look at the definition, as you see in the model here, again, there's still some work to be done in terms of how do you make this an applied thing.
So one of the things that Peter and I've talked about is the Georgia Tech work that we've been doing on the models would be level 1 to that balanced scorecard. And then there could be the next layer, which would be something around order reliability, forecast value add, perhaps, reliability or agility on that next layer.
Mm-hmm.
And there needs to be a working group, and we're not sure how to put this together after David finishes the models and Joseph finishes the models, which probably is going to be 2 or 3 months because, this is still a lot of work, is how do we get that layer that drives those top level financial metrics? And we're not clear how to do that. We're thinking about that hard, and ASCM's gone through some reorganization. And but what are your thoughts about how we might do that? Because the PRTM data is now with PwC.
Correct.
And I have approached PwC because they've got the benchmark data on customer service. That's the only source I know for customer service, to see if they would participate. So any thoughts there?
So when we rehearsed this, the questions weren't quite as hard on TV.
You expect a free lunch.
So I think that the things that have worked up to this point is it's got to be open. And I think one of the good things about the model itself today is that it is open. Everybody can get access to it. The change process to the standard model is not real time. So if we want to make changes or recommendations to changes, there's going to be like, here's our reference point, which is that. When I'm pointing at that, I'm talking about the model online. And then there's, I'll call it, let's just call it a working group's recommendations, right? So if we align around a fundamental score, and this is what it is, to me, the first question then is, how does that fundamental score set of metrics represent itself on this section? So that's a working group. And so once we figure that out, we have some recommendations, and we can submit those recommendations to ASCM, as part of their change process. But I think we act on those recommendations, and then from an applied standpoint, what do I do with those recommendations? So there's always this idea, practice, or idea, application. This idea of just wordsmithing SCOR so that it looks good on paper isn't what's going to drive energy in the community. It's going to be, hey, this is a very simple thing that allows me to solve a couple of problems that I have, today. And I think that's the approach. So it doesn't have to be a huge working group. I think especially when we get to metrics, it doesn't have to be by process. It's really overall. And so I think it's a small working group. that gets to know what the new SCOR model is, gets to understand this research, and then kind of builds it in. More importantly, though, tests it out. That would be my thought.
So what Peter and I are going to do is let the Georgia Tech work finish. There's a person by the name of Arn who works for WHU, which we're hoping to publish a Harvard Business Review article on this research that Georgia Tech has done. So we continue to talk to Arn. Then what we are going to look for are participants that would like to work on this level of insight about the SCOR model, and then have a working group and then give that information to ASCM. No guarantees they'll take it because it's a collaborative group, but the more manufacturers we have, the more that it is research, the higher probability. But this won't happen real quickly.
So I think the think big is what you just described. The act fast is the idea test. I think those things can happen without seeing model changes on the screen. And so, again, the value of this is we actually have research-based data. We have the ability for a company to raise their hand and say, hey, I'd like to have a benchmark. I would like to see what my fundamental score is. So that is an act now. And it doesn't replace the PwC data, but it certainly gets us started without having to go through an entire agreement process to submit data, to get data back, to go through a 6 to 8. It's pretty straightforward.
So the question from Tim is, what data is available at a benchmark level at PwC? And it's the SCOR data. It's, over time, PRTM has had a benchmarking practice. As the SCOR model has changed, their benchmarking has changed. However, most of the PRTM model benchmarking is divisional. It's not corporate. So, for example, Dow has 19 divisions. I'm going to pick on Dow because Dave's here. They might have done a division in a region versus Dow corporate. And so it's very hard to tie, that more localized benchmark data to corporate data. Does that division represent the corporation? So there is some PRTM data. There's the old AMR research data. But other than that, we're pretty vacuous in the industry around customer service data. It's easy to get the inventory data, but that's really the issue. So the question is, could we get a small group of manufacturers to be able to look at their data and to be able to, build that second level of metrics and give a recommendation to ASCM? Well, that's a slippery slope. And the reason is that every company defines supply chain differently. My observation over the last 2 decades is, as we've implemented SRM, which there is no relationship in SRM, or CRM, which there's no relationship management in CRM, and ERP and APS, supply chains become more and more narrow, right? In fact, I went to a company where they had a big conference and they invited the customer service people and they're like, why are we here? We're not part of supply chain. And I went to another one and they invited the procurement people and they're like, why are we here? We're not part of procurement. And then they went to one where they invited the transportation team and they're like, well, we've never talked to these people. So different companies have very different definitions, but the argument that you're making is the industry argument of, are these results really influenced by supply chain? When supply chain was defined in 1982, it was from the customer's customer to supplier's supplier. The original definition was to be able to align, source, make, and deliver to improve value from the customer's customer to supplier's supplier. We've lost that definition. We've gone much more narrow. And so I don't really want to do the percentage. Right? I believe that if the supply chain is effective, we raise the whole organization. And I don't care if it's defined differently at Newell versus Dow. I really don't want to get into that argument.
So Tim, let me just look at I just online, I moved it to the economic, and you can see there's from an asset standpoint, that's what we're looking at. And you can see this was generated in absence of the research. Because if it were generated with research like we have, the return on fixed asset would be return on capital employed or expense, right? So there's some rejigging, I think, of these metrics to be able to represent shareholder here. So I think that's job number one. And then to be able to have a very simple benchmarking process that's open, doesn't require a corporate membership, doesn't require a lot, but a very simple benchmark that says, show me against the industry and give me my fundamental supply chain score. Then we go, okay, now what's next? And I think that's another working group. So I think the first one is really getting the metrics from the fundamental score represented somehow here, job one, so that when we benchmark, we can say, okay, now we've kind of closed that loop. And then the next one, it says, okay, how do I then represent, kind of the rest of the story? How do I use that?
But if you think about the so what who cares out of this session, we've got about 3 more months to finish the Georgia Tech work, and then we're going to publish, right, David? We
Just
got
say yes.
about 3 more months to finish the work we're doing here, and then we're going to publish, right, David? And don't you love it when I call on you? And but Peter and I are committed to collaborate. And Peter has a group of people that follow him, and I have a group of people that follow me. So we will do an open call for people that are interested to come up with a recommendation for ASCM for that next layer of metrics. And it would be good to be able to do modeling of those companies to this higher level, to be able to tie the top level to the secondary level. We're not sure what that's going to look like, but we're trying to figure that out. So, in the next couple of months, you'll see Peter and I publicly trying to, get participation. But today, we measure too many things. They're functional. There's no rationalization for collinearity. The industry feels really good, and they shouldn't, because 98% of companies underperform their peer group.
To reinforce what Laura just said, I just, again, went to inventory days of supply, which is a reverse calculation of inventory turns, right? So again, if we were doing things based on research, that would be different slightly. But you can see represented in there is, where does this metric show up in the processes? And you can see it's all over the place. It shows up in orchestrate, it shows up in planning, it shows up 3 different places in planning. So I think, again, the question is how do we start to refine this thinking and better represent, what an organizational point of view.
So you can't just rush out and implement the SCOR model and lift the Georgia Tech balance scorecard. Yeah. And for those that are students, it's very useful for you to understand this model, because as you do recruiting, it gives you a good reference model to ask questions of, what do you measure? Why do you measure that? How closely aligned are you? As people, how do you define supply chain? Don't be surprised if you say, how do you define supply chain? And you get this pregnant pause. You got to be really comfortable with this pregnant pause, because people will go like, haven't thought about that, so yeah.
And just notice the free course on the upper right hand, right? I know for students, free is nice. So available to all. So
let's just see if anybody online has a question or a comment. I think you can unmute them, right, Peter? Because, we've got the low tech sharing here. Thanks. We appreciate Georgia Tech allowing us to do the sharing, but it's not the world's best, sharing. So do we have any questions or comments? Questions or comments in the room? Thoughts? Fred, what are your thoughts? How do we go from here? Why don't you come up here so we can hear you? So the whole group can hear you. This is Fred Bauman. Fred, how long have you been in supply chain?
About 30 years.
About 30 years, okay. And you tell the group a little bit about your history.
Yes, I had scar tissue as a supply chain planner, working at Pillsbury and General Mills, worked closely with Walmart and others. And then I played product management roles in demand management, collaboration, S&OP, those types of things. And now I am a industry principal, so I work with senior leaders to help define where they want to go and hopefully align capabilities that we have at Kinaxis to meet those objectives.
So you've been through 4 or 5 different technology companies?
3.
3, okay. Are the technology companies clear on what drives value?
I think they do a good job in optimizing functional value that we talked about, right?
Uh-huh.
So you think a lot about supply chain, and particularly, they're very good at optimizing to an objective that might be within a function. I think there is opportunity to drive more cross-functional alignment, and the work with you around outside in, trying to use that bi-directional orchestration to make better decisions is a real focus and opportunity for us.
And, you know, it's sort of the circular thing is the technology companies want to do what the business users want to do. The business users keep asking for functional optimization. So we keep building bigger and more expensive engines for functional optimization that throws the supply chain out of balance, which causes us not to make progress.
Yeah. So I think, you know, a learning for me, you asked before I came up here, where do we go from here?
Mm-hmm.
Is how do we expose at the time of decision the trade-offs of those different metrics
Mhm.
and reinforce the due north, help us due north around market cap as, you know, a proper due north, right?
And do you like the fundamental score concept?
I do.
Okay. All right, great.
Thanks.
Any questions on Zoom, Peter? Any questions from the audience or comments or thoughts? Yes. Can you come up because they can't hear you? Is there a technology aspect of this? I think there is, you know, so one of the issues is that we have a lot of companies that are scarce on resources to deploy technology for functional optimization, right? So we have a lot of production scheduling or a lot of transportation planning. And we've got those companies that are making money deploying those solutions. But then when those solutions are deployed, it's like, yeah, I don't think I really got what I thought I was going to get out of those solutions, right? And so how do we help those companies to go to the next level to be able to build the balanced scorecard into their solutions? And I think we're at the point where we have RISE coming in, where people are going to want to upgrade SAP to that next level of RISE. And there's a question about what do I need for a system of record and what do I need for a system of optimization? I'm hoping that this level can change so that we can rethink to get a balanced scorecard in that kind of evolution as we make that shift to, you know, the online RISE platform. I'm hoping. But the technology companies, you know, it really depends upon the leadership and I think how they're driven by their clients. Yeah, Peter. Matt Spooner, can you unmute? You got a question?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, I do.
It's good to hear from you. So I'll give you a little background about Matt. Matt is in Switzerland and Matt actually worked on this with us early on. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing really well, thank you. Let me just turn my light on so I'm a bit clearer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's maybe 2 questions, a combined question. I'm very interested in the fundamental score, and I know that this is something we discussed early on, so I'm quite excited to hear that you're progressing this. But I've recently been doing some research based on data that I can find, which is available, which I think is very limited compared to the data that Peter's used. But if you look at inventory to sales ratio going back to 2005, you can see that actually in 2005 the inventory to sales ratio was about 8% better than it is today. So we've in the last 20 years, the initial evidence is that we haven't really made a large improvement. If we improve that, and I know there's some issues with inventory to sales ratio, but if we improve that with a fundamental score, do you feel that we will actually be able to demonstrate that supply chains perform better today than they have done over the last 20 years?
Well, first of all, my goal with the fundamental score is to change the discussion. And, you know, my big, hairy, audacious goal, Matt, is to have a Harvard Business Review article on the fundamental score and compare companies against their peer group on the fundamental score. then to characterize the delta as waste and really tie it to corporate sustainability and waste. You know, if you think about inventory that we're carrying in warehouses, it's really not working for us. That's a sustainability issue. We've got a warehouse, we moved it. Those are typically items that will landfill. And if you look at particularly the EU on what's happening on digital passport for 2007, I'm hoping we can have a discussion on waste and how do we get rid of waste in the supply chain to drive value. That's my big, hairy, audacious goal. Now, maybe I don't get a Harvard Business Review article. Maybe I get supply chain management review article, and maybe I've got to do webinars, and maybe I've got to educate all the consultants and educate all of the technologists. In my heart of hearts, I think supply chain leaders are extremely competitive and they want to have the best supply chain. So I'm going to basically move in that vein around how do you become, you know, the best fundamental score in your peer group kind of leverage. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good move. I think it'll be very interesting when we start looking at the data, and particularly data that's connected to value.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you for all your hard work. Matt worked on this for like 8-9 months, right?
Yeah, about that.
We wouldn't be here without, you know, some of Matt's work. So thank you for joining today. Anybody else got a question or comment or thoughts? Yes, SCOR metrics, okay. What is the best practice for the deployment of SCOR metrics is the question, I think. And yeah, Peter, and I think it depends, you know.
You have two opinions.
Well, Peter and I will disagree on a number of things, but you got to love us for this. One is, I don't think any company has one supply chain. And I think that the set points have to be different, understand the characteristics of the supply chain. And two, excuse me, I think that, you know, you need to have cross-functional agreement on those SCOR metrics, right? You cannot be a functional, but go ahead.
We agree on both of those things.
Okay.
My strategy for figuring out at the control, I'm going to use control tower, you know, at that macro level, is you have to define your supply chains. And I do that by listing out in a matrix, here's my products, here's my customers, or product groups, customer groups, however. And every time you have a product that goes to a customer, I would call that a candidate for a supply chain, right? Not perfect, but close. The question is, when you gather your data for all these supply chains, because again, these cut across your business, how do I then segment that same data? And you've already said it once. Every business unit defines perfect order fulfillment just a little bit different. So when I go to get this field data from this field here in this business unit, and I try to aggregate it with this one, it doesn't mix. To your point, it's got to be a top-down kind of strategic decision where you're using the system of record the way it was intended to be, just to get back to what I call basics. So I think there's been too much ground up by business unit, you know, and there's got to be some kind of a reconciliation of here's the top down, here's the most important things that add value. And I think that will change the conversation. And I think that's what excites me about this research, is because it's really top down. It will drive the conversation, you know, from north to south.
The risk is that Georgia Tech overthinks it, makes it too complicated in the academic literature, and it's not usable, and we can't do that. Right, David? Have I made my point clear? This is not about the best R squared. This is about usability, simplicity, and actionability. Yeah, Dave, why don't you come up here? Because it looks like a long discussion. So this is Dave Winstone from Dow, and Dave is joining us a little late today because he had some travel issues. And these things happen going north, right? Okay, so your thoughts, Dave?
So the perspective I want to offer, well, I think the value of this is in pushing the supply chain agenda and the supply chain strategy up in the organization to the executive suite. Okay, they're not going to understand an R squared, to Laura's point. They don't care about that. They don't want 10 things, they want 3 or 4. And being able to have them understand that the value supply chain brings to the company, moving that market capitalization, is going to be huge. And that's going to help us drive two things in my view. One is consistency across the division. So we're a big company, lots of divisions. To Peter's point, we started by every division doing something different. And so we've got bits of everything going on everywhere. So we get consistency across the divisions. We also get consistency of focus on what's important over time. So we don't have corporate initiatives swinging us off out of balance because we're restructuring something over here. We've got a growth initiative over here. And that, I think, allows us to be able to drive more consistency and ultimately better performance inside of companies with this.
So give the group a little bit of flavor about the complexity of Dow. How many divisions, how many planners, how many systems, because I think a lot of times people don't understand the complexity of the large multinational.
Yeah, so Dow's a big, so you think about Dow. The other thing I think is important when you're looking at this 20, 30 times, Dow's changed.
Yes.
So the Dow that I represent today is a mixture of a bunch of companies that used to be Dow Corning and Roman Haas and DuPont and a bunch of other ones as well. So companies change over time. We have 19 different business units. You picked the right number earlier. That are in 6 business groups and in 3 divisions. Okay. We're a $50 billion company. We have about 500 planners spread all around the world in now 5 center locations all around the world. And we have about 2,000 people giving input to forecast, this consensus collaborative forecasting process that we have. So that's the size and scale that we're trying to operate, and trying to get everyone to work consistently to a synchronized cadence in that becomes a challenge, even when you implement the latest software technology. And I think that's been my learning over the last several years. You put in all this technology, you have these high expectations, you get sold a great bill of goods. It's really hard to make it work because you've got 2,500 people all touching it, having to do things with it, and trying to get them all to operate with discipline and to a cadence. It becomes really, really hard. And when you do, you get a plan. And the first thing you'll realize about a plan that you get from that is it's wrong. And stuff changes all the time. And so I think, the next generation, Laura, I've talked about that as well, is how do we supercharge the what-ifing at a more strategic level on top of that to get companies better prepared for what might happen in their supply chains in the real world. So that's the complexity of Dow and where I see that going.
Yeah, I would love to get us to self-service supply chains for what ifing and to be able to look at that. But okay, let's just take a deep breath, right? So what we need is a simple, actionable model from Georgia Tech that we can put in the academic literature and then form a manufacturing retailer kind of influence group for ASCM to try to get the SCOR metrics to align to those top level metrics. And I'm not going to, pull any punches. I don't think the SCOR metrics are perfect, but they're the best we've got in the industry. And at least it's a framework to get started on. Anything else to add, Peter? Well, that's why I'm really excited about the fundamental score. The fundamental score is a way that we can do benchmarking publicly, and that we can kind of get the juices of the supply chain leaders to compete with each other and change the discussion. Deep cleansing breath. It's 1:26. I want to take a 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to say, what do we do differently? So we're going to do some group activity, okay? It's so funny. I'm doing some research right now. I've interviewed 40 companies on the use of supply chain planning tools to drive supply chain excellence. So the conversation goes something like this, tell me about your organization, tell me about your planning journey. How do you know if you have a good plan? Dead silence. Nobody can answer that. What was your vision for what good looks like? How did you do against what good looks like? Dead silence. Can't answer that. We really implemented technology for technology's sake versus really being clear on what the outcome is. And then I will ask, how do you translate operating metrics into P&L and balance sheet discussions for finance? And they can't answer that. Of the 40 interviews I've done, only one company could actually talk to me about operating metric translation into P&L. And most people aren't as gutsy as Mary was to say, I don't know what operating margin is. Okay. I believe 99% of supply chain leaders don't know what operating margin is, or the difference between operating margin and gross margin, or the role of cost of goods sold. We just don't have that level of understanding. And we're not teaching it in academics, and we're not really driving it in, our systems. So I think up level the planning organization is a great thing. That bottoms up, tops down kind of metrics alignment, I think is really important. And I'm hoping that with the release of the fundamental score, that we can do some kind of an educational kind of thing where we can talk about what that looks like. Okay, how about at Western Digital? What you gonna go do? To define value? And you should talk to Matt about working with us on this level 2 alignment. I think he would be a great company to work with us on that. I think if you did that, it would really help your organization. Yeah. How about at E&Y? What you gonna go do? And unfortunately, I find so many consultants are so focused on the implementation of the technology, right? And, when I ask them how they define what good looks like, they'll say, well, it was implemented on time, right? Or in budget, right? And I'm like, but did you get the value from it, right? And so many people don't really have a construct of what is value and how does what I'm doing drive value. So how does schedule adherence drive value? How does, cycle stock management drive value, right? So I'm hoping it helps, right? Because Rich, what you gonna go do?
Well, I don't have a plan.
I know, but you're working with PE guys, right? Who don't have a clue about supply chain.
I think,
And so if you think about actioning that, because you've worked with a lot of companies, what are the things that come to mind about the top 5 ways you've seen people action that?
for metrics and time and showing how it improves the overall. It
So give me an example of a supply chain metric.
could be in terms.
Okay,
I'm not saying that's the right one.
but we've got inventory turns of the model.
Right.
Are you thinking about on-time delivery? Are you thinking about,
Thinking of-
okay,
I'm not thinking about like, yeah, perfect.
okay, right.
Those available in my charts?
No, they're not available. It's not, there's no data set. This is the problem.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, Tim?
Internal, that's huge. And that's a way to, you should think about it, have to do this internally. And then I think we need to think about what the problem is for public companies that we is not
Right.
saying. We need to think about what are the proxies.
I can't come up with one, but I think there is a Harvard Business Review article called Staple Yourself to an Order. Has everybody read Staple Yourself to the Order? It's a classic. It's like one of the best articles. And I think that if I were running a supply chain, I would write a similar paper about how do you drive revenue, which is for a supply chain person, how do you contribute to revenue and, make it very specific. So, for Dow, it might be for the 19 supply chains, right? So I'm going to pick on Dave, but they've got a lot of cross company shipments, right? Where one division is a vertically integrated, will service another division, which will service another division. And sometimes, when they have to short orders, do I short one to an internal plant or do I short it to an external customer? Well, it depends upon the bonus incentives, right? And so if you look at how you make those choices, because we really don't have good systems, in my opinion, for allocation and ATP, because we've really not run, many ifs to many thens for that kind of dynamic decision making. Even if it's something like that, like staple yourself to an internal order or, help understand the allocation system and the impact of the decision you make on revenue, right? I don't know, it's an idea. All right, hey, Dave?
I really like that.
Well, and to be able to do that as we look at the impact on revenue employee, so many times somebody in supply chain will say, I can't impact revenue per employee. I'm like, oh my gosh. One of the things I'd love us to do is do intelligent agents for test and learn and digital twin, right? Why are we not testing and learn based upon market data, right? in vitro to look at, alternative selling strategies or channels, or why are we not looking at, how do we, really continually orchestrate to realign product strategies with market strategies to be able to look at maximization of assets, right? Most people start thinking at that level. All right, it's been a long day. We've had an earthquake. We've had people come in and out. But did you have fun? Yeah. So our next step, Matt, do you want to add anything to what are you going to do about it before I close?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm following this, Laura. I think it'll be good to have a follow-on discussion. There's a lot to think about.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad you're a deep thinker, so a lot to think about. That's good. All right, so I've taken you into the deep end. And the good thing is you survived. So what you're going to see in the next 3 months is I'm going to write the supply chain Stoudemire when David and Joseph finish the fundamental score. And what I want to do is use the fundamental score as an action item for us to rethink value. I will partner with Peter to be able to build those level 2 metrics, to be able to do testing to try to influence the score model. I am going to work with the simulation and optimization vendors to be able to redefine the digital twin, to be able to do organizational modeling, not just functional modeling. And I'm going to try to help people everywhere to think about how do we drive value in the value chain. So thank you for coming today. Any last thoughts before we close?
I know I jumped out.
Yeah, but you had a reason. He's closing a plant on the West Coast. Do you want to add anything here?
Well, not really, but I do want to say thanks for doing this work and pulling people together to have these conversations, share, and learn. It's much value, I'm not trying to disparage anything, but we go to various conferences the last 2 or 3 days, and I probably got more out of a single day than I've gotten out of the last 2 conferences that I've been to. So I really appreciate this.
Oh, good. I will, next time I'm talking about this is a couple of ASCM small roundtables. So, if you want me to talk in your organization when I publish the supply chain Stoudemire on the fundamental score and the opportunities, I'd be glad to do that. My goal is to change the industry because I think supply chains build economy, and hopefully we can do better about saving the world, right? All right, so last round of thanks for Gonza and Joseph and David for going on this journey. I appreciate you coming. Safe travels.